For those of you who I haven't yet met, I'm Mary Kershaw, the Executive Director of the Museum of Northern Arizona, and it is my very great pleasure to welcome you to the second in a series of conversations about cultural appropriation that the Museum of Northern Arizona is doing in partnership with the Sedona Art Center. I also do just want to say, I see a lot of familiar faces and people who know MNA even better than I do because you've been here for decades. But for those of you for whom this is your first visit, I hope you do have an opportunity to have a look through the galleries and explore the delights that we have here at the museum. The Museum of Northern Arizona focuses on the art, science, and culture of the Colorado Plateau, and today's topic is absolutely central to our mission. So with that, I am going to hand over to my colleague, Julie.
As Mary said, I am Julie Richard. I'm the CEO of Sedona Art Center, and I'd also like to welcome you all here today. I want to thank Claudine Taliak and the staff at MNA for all of the hard work that they've done in putting this together, as well as my staff, Kelley Klemenko and Bernadette Carroll in particular, because there was a lot of work and a lot of moving parts to make this happen. So let's give them a round of applause. I also want to thank the Arizona Humanities Council for their financial support in pulling this together as well. We couldn't have done it without them, so let's give them a round of applause. So my job is to set the stage for how this all came about. So the concept for this series really came about a few months after my arrival in Sedona, which is about 2.5 years ago now, when a guest came into our gallery shop, and after asking staff a few questions about a particular artist's work, they declared the work cultural appropriation and turned on their heels and left. Needless to say, our staff was very upset by this, and mostly because if we were doing something wrong, they wanted to fix it. So they brought the issue to my attention, and I was told that this was something that had been happening for several years, actually, but had never been addressed. So we discussed the concept of cultural appropriation at a few staff and board meetings, and it was clear we all needed to know more. So I began to do research on cultural appropriation policies in arts organizations to see if there were some examples that we could maybe use to adapt to us. After making calls to museums, surfing the web, finally calling my contact at the National Endowment for the Arts, I came up with exactly nothing. I could find no museums or organizations that had a cultural appropriation policy. At that point, and Mary was one of those people that I called as well to get her input on this, and then I called her back after all of this. And I told her what I'd found, and she was very interested in this concept as well. And I asked her at that point if MNA would be interested in partnering with us on a series of lectures and discussions around this topic, with the ultimate goal of gaining information, getting clarity, and potentially coming up with a joint policy statement that both of us could use. She said yes, and planning began. So we hope this series helps all of us understand more and what can be done to understand appropriation of Indigenous art forms and culture and support Native artists and entrepreneurs. This is an opportunity for all of us to be more mindful, ethical, and respectful allies and advocates. Again, we're so grateful to MNA for partnering on this series, and I hope that you all travel to Sedona Art Center in January for the third and final discussion around this topic. So I hope you enjoyed today's discussion. Thank you.
Welcome everybody, I'm Kelley Hays-Gilpin. I'll be moderating today. And I'm going to keep it pretty brief here and start by introducing Chef Brett Vibber, Chef Jaren Bates, and podcaster extraordinaire Andi Murphy. So you'll be hearing from them in a moment. And as mentioned, this is the second in our series, and in the first one we focused a lot on counterfeit Native American jewelry And that kind of appropriation, cultural appropriation, was pretty obvious once we got into the legal framework and so forth. So this time you've got by way of review, if you weren't at that first one, or as a refresher in your program, you have definitions of cultural appropriation, and we're going to move pretty rapidly into food sovereignty. So some pretty weighty concepts there. So just to review on cultural appropriation, we're talking about taking something from a culture other than your own. And that happens all of the time. But when is it appropriation? And we're looking at a power relationship there. So you ask yourself, is this from my culture? And what's the power relationship? Who benefits? Follow the money is another way to look at it. And that's pretty straightforward, I think, when we talk about sports mascots, which I'm sure everyone is aware of the logo of the football team in Washington and the controversy around that. We're fresh out of Halloween season. It's a culture, not a costume. I hope you've all seen that and understand that if I dress up as Vladimir Putin, one of the scariest people that I can think of, I'm not really worried about him or Russian culture being harmed or undermined by that act. So think about where the power is and if there's money involved. But if I go to a music festival and put on a counterfeit Plains war bonnet, that's really offensive to a lot of people in our country, Indigenous people, for whom that's a very important symbol with spiritual significance. There's a power differential there with what am I allowed to get away with and who's being oppressed and appropriated in that situation. So this is a little harder when it comes to food, right? So we're looking at a pretty broad, important part of all cultures here. You know, food is one of the most important things in all cultures. And I think a lot of us in this country, teaching college at NAU, I find out that a lot of my students don't know what's Indigenous and what isn't. They think potatoes came from Ireland. And my ancestors had some up and down relationships with potatoes in Ireland, right? They come from South America, I'm telling my students as the scientist, the archaeologist that I am. But I didn't know until recently that there are North American potatoes that were grown in our region and were a staple crop. And these folks know about that. And so is it okay for non-native peoples and non-native chefs to use Indigenous foods? What's the relationship there? What's the best ethical way for us to learn more and practice sustainability and honor food sovereignty? So that's what I'm going to throw out for the panel.
We're going to start with the poll question.
Oh, let's put the poll question up. Okay, so that's great. We've got some work to do. That means people are here because they're curious. They don't know yet what this is. And we're hoping that you do by the end of it. Okay. Are you familiar with how the cultivation of Indigenous foods changed when Native Americans were removed from their homelands? Okay. Some of us have an inkling, but we're going to hear more. Alrighty, so moving towards an understanding of these concepts, what do we think about non-native people or non-native chefs using these Indigenous foods, and what are ethical ways for them to do that? And you two have that microphone, and Brett, can you grab this one?
I'm not going to start.
Okay.
That answer. I know when to wait.
So when is it ethical for non-native chefs to be using Indigenous ingredients? Just by the number of food ingredients that are from Indigenous people just makes that an impossible sort of question to answer. Because like she mentioned, potatoes, tomatoes, chocolate, vanilla, corn, beans, squash, like all of that. You know, chili is like the basics of New Mexico and Arizona cuisine. So, and it's really hard to sort of, to answer that. But I think when we come to ingredients like quinoa, and we come to, to ingredients that are maybe harder to find and have, kind of like this niche market coming from a small community, I think that's when, chefs and people should really look at how their money is supporting the Indigenous community that is growing and harvesting these ingredients. Quinoa and amaranth are kind of popular right now, and sometimes these food trends become a real problem for people that we don't often see because they are in Mexico and lower parts of Latin America. So I think that's where people should really, stop and take a look at some of the food trends where these health foods like quinoa and amaranth are coming from, because they come from Indigenous communities.
Where to start at? I think in a way that, especially the type of cooking that me and my friend do is if he shows, I believe, when it comes down to more like traditional ingredients, like I like to use a lot of steamed corn in some of the recipes that we do, or Navajo tea or green thread, as well as mine, in a few recipes, and blue corn also makes an appearance. I think some of those, when it comes to those ingredients for food, I think the only ethical way to at least that can showcase and maybe allow some non-native chefs or non-native peoples to utilize them is maybe to go back and learn the tradition where it's come from, how it was farmed, why is it such a royalty in our culture, like the green thread is a big popular one. I believe that one is becoming a little more popular nowadays, but I think, especially now with it being used in sake that's produced here in Arizona, but I think if you, instead of just hearing about it and hearing about its benefits and just being that type of person, I'll go out and use this because it's how this chef used it and how he used his desserts or soups or stews with it. And then I think if you just maybe take a little bit of time to maybe, instead of going out and instantly wanting to have that effect or to use it, maybe reach out to the chef or chefs that know about that ingredient and do a little bit of research on it and see why we only harvest it every a couple months out of the year, or maybe once every couple of years, because as Andi was saying, certain ingredients are getting a lot more popular right now. Like sumac is a big one that everybody is jumping on board. Then also like tempeh beans, but tempeh beans, corn, like a lot of heritage corn is coming up to the forefront now, which has to go back to, well, these are only produced in small amounts for this reason, to be sold to other tribes or to give to elders around the area that they're growing at. And in our case, especially with me, is a lot of the corn that we use at the restaurant is grown by my family, so that's why we were able to get quite an abundance of it. But we also took the time to tell about where it was coming from, who was being farmed by, and also like the traditions, like especially the steamed corn that I use, is when everybody hears the story of how we produce the steamed corn from seed to fruit to then the process of it going from the ears of corn into the ground and that whole process, and then coming out where we got to dry it. That entails like, oh well, this isn't a product that's going to be widely available every year, because some farmers don't really get a whole lot of it, or they have a bad batch that goes through. And that's, in my way, I feel probably the best way to go about it, as far as any non-native chef or non-native individuals to use and maybe, or to cook with some of the ingredients that are traditional to indigenous peoples. That's what I have.
All right, we can all share. It's something I've had to walk kind of the lines of for quite some time in my career. I spent a lot of time in Japanese cuisine, and I've spent a lot of time now in wild food harvesting and things of that nature in my last couple of restaurants. I think it goes down to just the actual definition of appropriation. Am I doing this because I have a passion for it, a respect and a research and a basis of knowledge of it, or am I doing this to make money? And I grew up in Arizona. I'm born and raised in the Phoenix area, and my whole life I was either through family, scouting, and then cooking later. I grew up around a number of indigenous tribes, a number of indigenous people, where I was exposed to things I think, in a knowledgeable way, in a way that I was given some knowledge and things that were already naturally within me. Jaren and I have had about 20 years to discuss most of these things on truck rides and walks through the desert and forest. So it's not a new thing, because it's something that I always want to be conscious of. And like Jaren touched on, telling the story of it is I want to tell the story of the food and where it came from, and why I naturally found a way and found this path to cooking this way is at the basic root level out of sheer respect. So those kinds of things. I've never done it for the money. Excuse me. It was never a gimmicky ploy at the beginning to say, like, well, if I was the first white guy that had an all-foraged restaurant, and that concept might take off, and then we could cookie cutter it and stamp it and do it everywhere and make tons of money. It never was that. I enjoy my connection with the guy I cook with. I enjoy my connection with nature, and I think we share a lot of those similar passions that are passed down to you no matter where you came from. You're either a respectful person and respectful of indigenous cultures. I've been fortunate enough to live and work all over the world, where I wanted to see and embrace local culture, and cuisine's just a part of it, but it's a huge part of it, no matter where I went, and not be the American shouting at someone in Italy, because they don't speak English to them, or things like that, where I've always, from a very young age, found things like that off-putting. So I think when you walk that and the only person that really has ever accused me of appropriating indigenous cuisine was a white lady from Canada. So it's kind of strange for me, because like I said, I've grown up, Jaren and I have nearly grown up in this career together, and before that I had a lot of, like I said, influential native people that influenced me, whether it was through culture or cuisine, at the same time.
Can I add on to that?
Absolutely.
And if you want an example of a person who has who's kind of like the face of indigenous food appropriation, it would be Rick Bayless. He has become like this father of Mexican food for some reason, and has cookie cuttered his restaurants, his Mexican restaurants, and spewed them all over the place. Among us, foodies of color and indigenous, folks who are working in this food movement, he kind of embodies like the not only cultural appropriation, but also kind of like this love right now, or maybe it's a kind of like a build-up over the last couple years for Oaxaca and everything Oaxaca. I mean, I heard the term something like the Oaxacification of Oaxaca, where, you know, now foodies just need to go to Oaxaca and they need to get food from there and they need to eat at every restaurant there. But what's really happening in Oaxaca is gentrification. People are getting priced out of these places they had always lived, and it's becoming this tourist hotspot, which is not fair to the actual, you know, indigenous women who made this food. It's indigenous women who made all of this food, all of this indigenous food and Mexican food. And for some reason, Rick Bayless gets to have this whole empire and his wealth, his name, you know, by stealing it from indigenous Mexican women.
So I think Andi's defined and given us a great example of food sovereignty and why it's important, the rights of indigenous people to healthy and culturally appropriate food that they're producing in their own ways. And now I want to ask how colonization and removal from homelands has affected that for many tribes. How has colonization and removal affected food sovereignty and these rights?
Colonization is really what's wrong with everything in Native America, including our disconnection with food and how that's boiled down to you know, a lot of the health issues we have. I think you've heard about you know, all the health issues Native American people have and people of color, from you know, poverty and just living in food deserts, living physically away from some good food. You know, colonization of food started, you know, with warfare, you know, mowing everything down, burning everything, slaughtering everything, so the government could get control of these wild Indians and take the land. From, you know, boarding schools and erasing not only our language and culture, but also food knowledge and food culture. To right now with issues of like resources. You know, I think there might be a question about water in the future, but you know, all of that, including climate change, puts a bigger wedge, I think, between indigenous people and food and traditional food. But there's this whole native food movement, which is everything I've been writing about and talking about for the last 10 years, that is, you know, been underway for the last couple of years. And there's, in all of those spaces, I just kind of mentioned, there's work being done by indigenous people to turn that around and build that bridge between Native people and food.
To agree with, and add on about Andi's statement, yeah, everything about colonization is horrible for Native Americans and indigenous peoples altogether. I think for when growing up for me and knowing it and going seeing what my grandparents went through, because I come from more of a farming and ranching background, and I knew how hard it was just growing up and having to go out and help them out in the fields, how just a simple garden that we did every year, we'd have to work extra harder to get nutrients and minerals into the soil, so that because where we were at didn't have a whole lot of, we were just out, they pushed us out in the middle of nowhere. So, and in that effort, we've always had to do a lot more extra effort in order for our crops to grow, and also in finding out different methods as far as whether it was our ancestors coming up with their own, or going back into what they were taught from their parents or grandparents. And I feel that now that's being passed down through generations. Like even like my younger brother is a farmer, and he's taken over the family business that my dad and his dad had taken over, as far as like ranching and also farming and gardening around the area that we grew up in, and also learning how to take care of the land, and which is where, when I got into this, is probably maybe 6 years into it, I come to the realization that I didn't want to work with high-end ingredients anymore. I wanted to be more support locally, and then learning more about my culture, because I'll be completely honest with you right now, with you guys here, I didn't grow up very traditional in my household. And so a lot of the food knowledge that I'm now learning, I've learned through meeting with new friends, or coming up through asking my grandparents or cousins about certain things. And I look back and I was like, oh, well, that's why my grandfather, my Che, wanted us to do the water this way, and why he taught us a certain way of doing it, because that's how his parents, that's how his and our ancestors did it before colonization. And then going into it now, looking at how my brother does the farming and adding his modern techniques with it, and also old traditional techniques that we use growing up, that has influenced us to now, same thing with the food movement, is learning how to make everything as far as like what we're growing, not just for ourselves, but maybe to help out those that are around us. Elders is a huge thing for us in our culture, so we always try to make sure we take care of those before ourselves at least. And a lot of that comes from crops and getting what we're getting to get through. And since going back to nursing the ground and learning how to take care of the land, that's what at least I've come to relearn now as far as being a chef, and learning through these traditional cookings and ingredients is, it's always going to come back to learning how to take care of not just yourself but the earth, because even if it's just one little minute thing a day, that'll help down the road, hopefully, or it'll also give you an impact and view of like, well, this is how the indigenous peoples have done it for years, and the fact that it's just now getting brought to light is a little disheartening, but also there's a reason why maybe we didn't share some of those skills out to the outside public, as opposed to just our own culture. And I feel that's probably one of the things that is a little, I don't want to say typecasted, or what's the word? I feel that's one of the views that has come in this colonization, is being able to find better sustainable ways of farming, and also being able to not so much to where it's going to damage the land, but also help out the land as well. Because I believe now that with what we're doing, as far as with some of the ingredients that are coming to highlight that have been found, like I think the one is a really good ingredient that everybody is known for or knows about is the taproot, and how that came back into fruition, and how that has come back into our lifestyles. And even though it's not from Navajos, it's from another Native American tribe that has held on to their culture, and also their livelihood of what they grew up growing and what they ate from their ancestors. And so I feel like with that all gets passed down, and that's, again, helping all the indigenous people out, but also showcasing that we can, as long as we take the right steps into showcasing it and the techniques, and whether it's cooking, farming, or just teaching and educating in general, I think it helps as far as like getting past and towards the decolonization for us.
I think one thing that Andi touched well on was the erasure of education in their systems that natives had in place before colonizers arrived, in this country, where it's the same thing but different, obviously. On my side, I didn't learn anything about native massacres growing up in school. I didn't learn anything about Indian removal acts. I didn't learn anything about Navajos being moved from central Arizona to across the country to halfway back to having their food systems damaged to, a regular white kid in Tempe growing up 40 years ago would have told you fry bread tacos are native food. Where it took a course of time to learn, how their food systems have been changed, what actually is Native American food, how do you respect it, how do you, embrace it and support, which is, what we do, when purchasing any of the native ingredients that we need to use in our cuisine is how are you supporting these families? Now on the back side of it is, we talked in the first question about, are you just making money off of it? Is it a gimmick? But, if it's not, then are you supporting people from different tribes and different cultures and that helped you along the way to give me, this kind of knowledge and this kind of information? I saw a sign a long time ago that it was something quite simple, but it had a lasting impact, and it was just a cartoon of a pilgrim and a cartoon of a native, and the pilgrim was saying, we're here to teach you about religion, education, construction, and government, and the native said, we already have all those things. So that's the difference between me. Like I said, I've lived in a lot of different places in the world, and people move around, but there's a difference between immigration and colonization, where if you're coming, like Andi touched on, to slash and burn everything, to start it over and force people into having to think like you or having to live like you, then you're in a different boat of society than I am. If you're able to embrace and have passion and respect for other people's indigenous livelihoods, then I think we're all in a better place. I think we're learning a lot right now, as we've only been here as Europeans for a few hundred years maximum. We're learning a lot of things that we've made mistakes on, how we fight forest fires, how we, appropriate water, what we do with water, damming rivers, making lakes, and all of those things where, you see that societies and people shift around based on all of these things. But if you look back at, we look often at like where some of our best foraging spots are. They're in very close proximity to ancient ruins, and it makes sense. That's where the food wanted to be cultivated, or that's where the food wanted to be gathered, and that therefore led people to being in those spots. It wasn't pushed out on the flat deserts of New Mexico or the middle of nowhere in Oklahoma and things like that. They already knew where they were thriving as a society, and it took people pushing them away from that to push them down as a society. And what's really cool, I think, in the last 5 or 10 years is seeing a lot of Native American chefs come really to the limelight, and they're, Sean Sherman says he's taking back his foodways and his food paths, and I think that's an important thing that, Jaren touched on it a little bit. Maybe they didn't share it for a long time for a reason. It's something sacred, it's something to be protected, and it's not for everyone. So that's for me, my outsiders looking in.
Thanks, everybody. I think that goes a long way towards differentiating appreciation and a desire to be part of the solution rather than continuing to be part of the problem, and appreciating rather than appropriating. You mentioned wild foraging, and this is something that comes and goes in popular culture in a way, like you were talking about. And how can we learn sustainable foraging techniques? How can we appreciate wild ingredients that the earth presents on its own terms without over-exploiting, over-harvesting, or trespassing on communities' needs to access those materials, those ingredients, those plants and animals?
I think when it comes to foraging, and the best, probably ethical way to go about it is, well, for one, is don't just go out there and start picking wild foods and think that they're all, that everything's edible, because it's not. Even though that is how
Safety first.
Yeah. Finding someone that knows the area very well, whether it's a forest guide or in this case, if you know chefs that are out there like me and Brett, we love taking people out on nature hikes and taking a little bit of not just the history of the food that we're looking for, but also the history of the land. Those are two very good ways, and also maybe doing a little bit of research, whether it's on the internet, or maybe going a little bit more old school, buying a few books on foraging in the Southwest. I know I have a few that are both on, whether through edible foods that are just based on like use in certain basic recipes, and others and more that go in depth as far as like their medicinal use, and then go in there and then maybe find like a forest guide, and then they'll take you on where the best spots, or not the best spots, but the best, most areas that aren't going to be necessarily inhabited by a bunch of individuals. So that's kind of how we go about things, is we don't stay close to town. We go out to where it's remote as possible, and to go find whether it's mushrooms or wild greens or acorns. We try to get out as far as the public as we possibly can. And then in that sense, we basically, we don't ravage and take everything from one area. We just pick as much as we can from that area, and then we leave the rest for wildlife, whether it's animals as well as the food, as well as nature in itself. And maybe some random hiker that knows a lot about foraging comes through there, that knows the area very well, knows what to pick. Because then when you're taking everything from that certain area, you're not guaranteed that it's going to come back the following season, because you took everything from it. So that's why if you're going out foraging, once you learn a little bit more about it, you widen your spectrum out a little bit more, so that way you can have, like, maybe you have berries in 3 different spots, or then you pick maybe enough for your family in 2 of those, and then when you go out to pick again, you go to another spot, so that way you're not continuously harvesting from one area. And that same rule goes into farming, same as well, as like you never want to grow your garden in the same area, same vegetable in the same spot of your garden every year. You want to rotate them, so that way you get the same amount of nutrients out of the soil, and you're not going to get left with something that's either inedible or you lose it because of the soil is tarnished. Same thing goes with foraging, is you don't want to over forage one area, because if you do over forage one area, then you basically ruin that spot for your next season to come in, or for another group to come through.
I mean, we've been foraging together for a better part of 2 decades, so a lot of the same inputs. Like we tell people to follow the rules of 3s when they're foraging. Take a third for yourself, leave a third for nature, and leave a third for propagation, so that you're not just going in and clean cutting every single spot. Jaren and I design a lot of our menus either in the moment, where it's a chef's tasting menu that we don't have printed because we're not committed to it, and we're not committed to it for a reason. If acorns aren't abundant one year, we skip the year. If blackberries aren't abundant and aren't looking abundant, kind of into what would be the peak of the season, we skip a year, so that you're not forced, kind of in an old school chef's mentality of like, this is my menu, I have to have it. Therefore, we're ordering asparagus from Peru in January when it's out of season, and sweet corn that is it's a whole mess of how we order and how we purchase our food, even at the grocery store. If we want a sirloin steak, we go to the grocery store, we buy a sirloin steak. If we want baked potatoes with it, we buy baked potatoes. We don't know where they come from, we don't know how old they are, we don't know anything about it, but that's what we wanted, and we're used to eating that way. Where I think the love of wild foods, one, it helps you stay creative, and chefs like doing those kinds of things, but it also helps you realize what an unbalanced diet that we do eat, and how much we overeat of certain things, how much we undereat of certain things, what vital nutrients our bodies are lacking at this point in time, because our diets become so far from nature, far from what nature, intended, of eating things that are close to your locale in the season that they're being grown. We have a lot of great farmers, like in the Phoenix area, that we're friends with, but a few that I just can't buy anything from anymore because they're just forcing water into the ground, and they want to be the only guys in Arizona that grow, you know, huge passion fruits or grow bananas or things like that. And you tell these people, like, you know, how come you're not buying any of this from me? And because it's not the season for it. It's not from here. It's not. You're, you know, appropriating another sense of the food system and things like that, where it's just, you know, Jaren touched on it, farming and foraging just the same as you don't want things to be too big, I think, at the end of the day, is things, you know, like a farm. Farms were meant to be small, and they were meant to be, you know, part of the community, not the whole thing that supported, you know, one big soybean farm that supported 10,000 jobs in this area. It's not how farming's supposed to be. It's not how cultivation's supposed to be. Foraging shouldn't be that way either, where, you know, we're going in and taking, like, we took every single blackberry out of here. We took, you know, it's hard sometimes because you want to take all the mushrooms that you found that day, but I'll tell you that much. But it's rewarding at the end of the day that that you didn't, and you know, you come back to a spot that's not a trendy spot on a Facebook page that you've actually scouted out and you know, mapped out and plotted for years and years and years, and, you know, people are having a lower season, you know, for whatever it may be, lobster mushrooms this year, for example. But I don't go to any of those spots, and we have our own spot, and everything was there waiting for us this year, and plenty of it, and we left plenty of it to be there next year for us. So, you know, when places get trendy and foods get trendy or anything gets trendy, we have this desire, as most of society, just to jump on it and suck it all up and just eradicate it. And that's, you know, I think it's a change of thought of how, you know, together, everyone moving forward in society would be better off. You'd be better off with climate change, you'd be better off with your food systems and your food paths, and you'd be better off all together in general at the end.
Thanks. Let's come back to climate change for just a minute, and water resources, water rights, clean water as part of food sovereignty. Some of our Hopi colleagues have talked a lot recently about they're worried about their own strains of maize. The corn that they grow is very adapted for dry farming, for very low water conditions and certain weather conditions, growing season, and so forth. And the Rio Grande Pueblos grow corn that's adapted for irrigation farming. And when you crossbreed those, you're undermining the dry farmed land races of corn just at the time when they're getting less water due to climate change. Can you think of other examples on what we can all do to be mindful of threats to these indigenous crops?
Yeah, the Hopi corn is a really good example of how a traditional crop, a variety of corn, is being affected. But you know, I guess the seed saving part of everything is pretty important too. And it's something that always kind of baffles me when I think about the work that some traditional native seed savers do. They somehow keep track of like thousands of little seeds in either their house or their backyard or something like that, and then they have like a collective of other seed savers that they work with and sometimes trade with. And I think it's important to support the work that they do and support the work and just learn about some of these land races, these traditional varieties of food, of agriculture. I think folks think that corn is just kind of one or two different varieties, but there are literally like hundreds of different varieties. And you know, some tribes, they grow corn just for some certain ceremony. They grow corn just for, you know, this kind of tortilla or bread, and another corn is for drying and making soup later. So it's not all the same. And I think right now in our society, we're starting to become a lot more interested in food and really starting to think about some of the issues that are attached to our food. And just this panel here and this whole series is a testament to that. But also, just be mindful of how our communities, especially like here in Arizona, are situated along the river, and how much it takes from the river and takes away from tribal communities. I don't think there's a need for like green fields of grass here in Arizona or in front of everybody's yard. Or like water parks and stuff like that here in Arizona, at least along the Colorado River. We need to have serious conversations about how we use water, especially in the Southwest. And I know it's hard because that's kind of going up against a whole bunch of big money.
I think for climate change and how it's affected, Andi talked a little bit about it with the corn, and I know one ingredient, or actually there's two ingredients that I know that have been reintroduced, that have been brought back to life, solely because of seed savers, but also because of how, more importantly, how they were nearly extinct. And one of them is the Navajo peach, which, come to find out, where I grew up around the area of the Four Corners, there was nothing but peach trees all around the area, and they're not like the peaches that you would see in the store. Apparently they're a little bit smaller, a little bit more dense, and I just found this out probably 2 years ago, that a lot of the trees were wiped out because of climate change, because of global warming, and somehow this one family was able to hold on to their one little peach tree, and they eventually, with all the rain that they got a few years back, started to produce again. And this led her to save the seeds that came out of it, and has now started to reproduce that same varietal of peaches that we've had throughout hundreds of thousands of years ago. And another one that I had the opportunity to get my hands on earlier, a few months ago, is she brought up earlier about the potatoes. Everybody thinks they're from Ireland, where actually there's, from the Navajo peach, there's also the Bears Ears potatoes that have just now started coming back up as far as being able to use again, and found it with a little bit of local farms around the area. My friend Tyrone actually gave me one that I gave as a gift to my younger brother, because I had read about them and had done a bit of research on them before. I was like, oh, well, this is a pretty cool ingredient that I've never really thought I've ever would have imagined that was grown here on the res. But again, when you go back to seeing how, the only reason why they weren't, it wasn't ever profound here is because of the global warming and climate change, and also us being forced out into a desert where these certain ingredients had to learn to thrive, or were thriving before, but since damming up rivers and global warming has all affected all that, as well as relearning learning new farm techniques, or old farm techniques, as far as dry watering conditions. So I feel like those two has been something that has been taken away, but has come to light again through seed saving, and also through learning how to growing sustainably. As far as you don't want to water every day. You don't want to have your sprinkler systems running on 24 hours, 7 days a week. Whereas it's like you learn all these techniques, and it's helping all these old heritage varietals coming back to light, and so much so that a lot of celebrity chefs are using some of, not necessarily the peaches or the potatoes, but temporary beans and corn that's going out there. But again, it all comes back to how it was farmed, how it was grown, and where it came from. And I believe that with the climate change that's happened, it's been both bad and good for us right now, because we have been getting a lot of moisture lately the past couple of years, which has led us to go be out in the forest looking for a bit more varietals, species that have been dormant for quite a while. And so I think that's probably one of the things that I feel as far as climate change is both had its negative impact on and has also a little bit, somewhat of a good beneficial impact as well.
Well, I'm getting the high sign that we're almost out of time. One more word from Brett, or we could go to, let's go ahead and put up our poll and see if we've been successful.
Can we ask questions?
Yeah, just could we take it easy? What I was going to suggest is that we put the poll up so people can do that while we do a Q&A. Okay? All right, do we have a question? We do.
Yeah, well, I have a question about cultural appropriation, because I understand how invasive that is, and there's another word where you exploit cultural properties for profit. But in the name of food is something that cultures have shared cross-culturally for centuries. You know, for instance, the Navajo churro lamb came over with the Columbian Exchange. So did cattle, pigs, chickens, and stone fruits, by the way. So that becomes part of the culture once the culture learns how to steward it, and it helps with their survival, and it becomes, you know, sacred to them. But I think, I don't think you can call cultural appropriation bad when it's a matter of survival or enhancement of a culture's existence in a particular landscape, because food has always been something that travels with people. And potatoes, in some ways, has been part of that. But anyway, so the whole Columbian Exchange, you know, if you go into wheat and rice and corn, there's a whole body of history and culture that goes along with those things. I mean, where would the Italians be without tomatoes? So that's one thing. The other thing I think is that food sovereignty depends more on access to land and water than anything else. You know, I mean, because if you don't have that, it doesn't matter what policies or what goals you have in mind for your community. And that's a statement. But anyway, address the cultural appropriation.
Well, thanks for the statement. Does anyone want to respond to that, or shall we take, is yours a question?
Mine is very much related to hers.
Okay.
So we might as well piggyback
Okay.
here and
Go for it.
bundle it. I was and I was realizing right from the beginning, we are not chefs. I don't know, I mean, we are home chefs. And it's a very different thing to be talking about cultural appropriation of, you know, indigenous, native, or Italian, or Chinese, or Japanese, or any cultural ways of using food and ingredients and so forth, and then making money off of that. That's very different from those of us who want to know, okay, I really like that, you know, that blue corn cookie. That was delicious. I'd love to know how to make that. Or those of us who, like, I work out and volunteer at the Colton Garden. There's a whole back section there, we call it the back 40, where there's Hopi corn, and and the guys come in, the elders come in and they plant it. Hopi corn and squash and pumpkins and all kinds of beans. And we've got a lot of different kinds of beans growing out there. Now, I want to use what we've planted out there and what I've been told I can use and cook it. I don't believe that's cultural appropriation. And the other thing about food sovereignty is we are all of us victims of that. We have no control over, most of us, unless we're growing our own food. We have no control over what we are getting from the grocery stores and where it comes from. We have to make some choices, but by and large, we are victims of corporations that are just controlling food sovereignty. The idea of buying stuff from Peru and Brazil and yada, 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 thousands and thousands of miles away, makes me ill. So I don't know that that's a question, but I heard it's a statement. It's like,
Thanks for that statement too.
This food sovereignty thing.
Yeah, and what is cultural appropriation if it's not about profit?
Yeah.
I mean, why is it bad unless it's about exploitation?
But if it's not about that, then why can't we use like a Northern Italian recipe for pasta?
We're just about out of time here. I'm gonna have to let Kristen
I would just like
jump
to
in
turn
here.
into a question, because I can think of things in my family that are only eaten for special occasions and have deep significance to us culturally. And I'm wondering whether there's some of those things, because those are things that I can think of that if somebody made kisiel, which is a Polish dish that we only have on Christmas, as the end of the meal, if I were to have that any other time, it would feel really weird to me and very wrong if somebody else were to make it. So I'm wondering, what are those things that maybe then we can know, or how do we know which of those things that aren't just an ingredient or food that are okay, but are maybe more of a special dish that shouldn't just be served without that knowledge?
I think that goes right into the actual definition of appropriation. Is, are you doing the research to understand what you're doing, or something just tasted good for you and therefore you're you have blinders on from that point on, and I'm going to eat it? Well, maybe it's sacred to Jaren and his family, that corn that I tasted, and maybe it was just a gift in that point in time. So it's just a matter of not exploiting. Of course, anytime you turn a profit on it is not necessarily exploiting either. Our businesses have to stay afloat and whatnot, but it goes to the actual definition of it, and have you done the research? Have you learned from someone that has a hand? We always tell everyone learning mushroom foraging, you need to have someone's hand holding your hand that knows everything about it. And that's how I've liked to learn, and that's how I personally like to learn about native cuisine, from someone by their hand, from their mouth, with my eyes, and that goes a long way. So I don't think that any time you're making money off of it is appropriation, but I think anytime you're exploiting it, you're making money in the wrong way off of it. At least that's my viewpoint on it in general, and we definitely do have the ability to know where our food comes from. You don't have to go to the supermarket. You don't have to go to that supermarket. We have a better ability now, more than ever, I think, especially from the last few generations, that we're turning our views backwards in time. And someone that was in the room, I don't know if he still is, taught me a lot about that a long time ago, is to look forward. We have to look to our past for our food. And for me, that's it in a nutshell. So it did change how I shop at the supermarket. It did change how I source food. A very quick example was I needed 50 beef tenderloins in a steakhouse that I ran in Chicago some years and years and years ago, and the purveyor said, I don't have that many. And I said, well, he said, you realize if you need 50 tenderloins, that's 25 cows that need to be killed just for the piece that you want off of there. And in that moment, I realized that I needed to forge forward with my own concept and put together kind of what I'd been thinking. My restaurant was right across the street from Mr. Rick Bayless. So in all ways, shapes, and forms, it had become not real to me, and I needed to do things different. That's when we fairly quickly moved back to Arizona and started to really embrace what we thought it was, the way people should eat, the way they should know about their food, the stories that come with the plate. It is art on a plate, but it's not necessarily always the aesthetic art. It's the art of someone's story, their passion, their past that's driven it to this plate.
Well, I think we're going to have to wrap it up right there. We've got to get our chefs to another event. And so I want to thank you all so much for this. I've learned a lot, and I hope everyone has. Go ahead and tell us in that exit poll there if you've learned a little bit. Has this panel discussion increased your understanding of how appropriation impacts marginalized communities? And thanks so much, everybody, for coming. Thanks to our panelists.
Thank you.